Imagine a night sky over Crimea, heavy with silence, and then suddenly explosions tear through the darkness. The ground shakes, alarms scream, and people run into the streets not knowing where safety can be found. This is not just another night of war. This is the night when a new weapon entered the battlefield, a weapon designed to strike deep, far, and with precision. The Ukrainian long-range Flamingo missile has spoken for the first time, and with that single strike, the balance of fear in Crimea and, perhaps in all of southern Russia, shifted forever. Today we are witnessing a moment of panic, a moment of dread, and a moment of profound consequence. Russian military bases and infrastructure in occupied Crimea are no longer untouchable. The myth of security that Moscow tried to build for years is collapsing. The people who believed they were protected now find themselves running, searching for fuel, and watching the prices of basic necessities rise like fire spreading through dry grass. But how did we get here? Why is this missile so important? And what does it mean for Russia, Ukraine, and the wider war? Let us take a closer look. Context: for more than 2 years, the war that Russia unleashed against Ukraine has been defined by shifting front lines, endless destruction, and a constant battle between old strategies and new technologies. Drones, electronic warfare, precision artillery, all of these have shaped the conflict. But Crimea has always held a special place in this war. For Russia, Crimea is the crown jewel of its expansionism. It is the territory seized in 2014 and celebrated by the Kremlin as a symbol of national pride. Militarily, it is the fortress from which Russia projects power into the Black Sea. And politically, it is the heart of Putin's claim to historical destiny. For Ukraine, however, Crimea is both a wound and a mission. It is the land that must be returned, the land that symbolizes sovereignty, justice, and freedom. Every strike on Crimea is more than just a military action. It is a message, both to Ukrainians and to the world. This land is ours, and we will not stop until it is free. Until recently, Russian military facilities in Crimea enjoyed relative safety. Ukraine's weapons could reach some parts of the peninsula, but Moscow still believed in its defenses. The Russian Navy patrolled the waters. S-400 air defense systems stood watch, and propaganda reassured citizens that Crimea was secure. That illusion is now broken. With the arrival of Ukraine's domestically produced Flamingo missile, the situation has changed dramatically. Unlike earlier weapons supplied by Western allies, this missile represents Ukraine's own capacity to innovate and escalate. It is long-range, it is accurate, and most importantly, it can be produced on Ukrainian soil in growing numbers. The first strike was not symbolic. It was devastating. Ukrainian forces targeted a base of Russian border guards in northern Crimea, near the city of Armyansk. This was not just any base, it was part of the Federal Security Services network, a symbol of Moscow's grip over the occupied peninsula. Alongside the border post, a patrol boat facility was also struck, leaving behind chaos, fire, and panic. The message was clear: Russia's security in Crimea is an illusion. Transition to events, but the missile strike was only the beginning. At the same time, Ukrainian drones penetrated Russian airspace, striking one of the most critical facilities of Russia's fuel infrastructure, the Krasnodar oil refinery. This was not just another explosion in the night, it was a calculated attack on the lifeblood of Russia's war machine: fuel. And when fuel disappears, war becomes much harder to fight. Already, in occupied Luhansk, reports confirm that gasoline has completely run out. Across other regions, prices are skyrocketing, and in some towns, fuel stations stand empty. Panic buying spreads. Civilians feel the pressure. The Russian state, already strained, faces yet another crisis it cannot easily solve. This is where we stand today. A new weapon on the battlefield, a major refinery burning, fuel shortages deepening, and fear rising among civilians and soldiers alike. The catastrophe has only begun. The night of the first Flamingo strike will be remembered in Crimea for years. For many residents, it was the first time they felt truly vulnerable, the first time they realized that the war had crossed into their own streets, their own homes, their own fragile sense of security. But when the missiles flew over northern Crimea and slammed into the Russian border guard base near Armyansk, the ground itself seemed to roar. Witnesses described a sudden flash, a wave of sound, and then silence broken only by the cries of people and the sirens of emergency vehicles racing through the darkness. This was not a symbolic hit on an empty warehouse. This was a direct strike on the very structures that represent Russian control, the Federal Security Service outpost, and the patrol boat base that monitored Ukraine's border. For the Russian military, it was a wound to its pride. For civilians, it was a shattering of the belief that Moscow's defenses could protect them. The Flamingo missile itself is the subject of both fascination and fear. Developed in Ukraine under secrecy, it represents the country's determination to fight back with its own hands. Reports suggest that it is capable of flying hundreds of kilometers, evading air defense systems and striking with high precision. If Ukraine can mass-produce these missiles, the Russian military infrastructure in Crimea and even deeper inside Russian territory will face constant, unpredictable threat. For Russia, this possibility is terrifying. Air defense systems, once considered invincible, now look increasingly porous. Billions of rubles spent on fortifying Crimea may now prove meaningless. But missiles were not the only weapons unleashed. That same week, Ukrainian drones carried out a bold attack on the Krasnodar oil refinery, one of the most important facilities supplying fuel for Russia's military operations. The drones penetrated Russian defenses, bypassed radar, and struck at the heart of the refinery's processing unit. The explosion was massive, and satellite images later confirmed severe damage. Fuel is more than just an economic commodity, and war to it is the oxygen of the battlefield. Tanks, aircraft, supply trucks, even generators all depend on a steady stream of refined oil products. Without it, armies grind to a halt. By targeting the refinery, Ukraine was not simply damaging infrastructure, it was striking directly at Russia's ability to wage war. The consequences were immediate. In occupied Luhansk gas stations reported that gasoline had completely run out. Residents queued in long lines, only to be told that no fuel would be available for days, perhaps weeks. Anger and frustration grew. Across other regions of Russia, prices began to rise sharply. Some stations were forced to close temporarily, while others imposed strict rationing. For ordinary Russians, already battered by inflation and sanctions, this was yet another blow. The shortage of fuel is not just an inconvenience, it is a sign of systemic vulnerability. In war, every shortage ripples outward. Deliveries slow down, harvests go uncollected, hospitals struggle with supplies, and morale collapses. Each strike on Russia's energy infrastructure magnifies this effect, spreading fear and uncertainty far beyond the battlefield. For the Kremlin, these developments are deeply dangerous. Putin has built his narrative of power on the promise of control over land, control over resources, and control over people's lives. The moment ordinary citizens feel that control slipping, panic begins to spread. That panic was visible in Crimea, where people rushed to stockpile fuel, food, and cash. Videos circulated on social media showing crowded stations, arguments breaking out, and police struggling to maintain order. At the same time, the Russian propaganda machine tried to downplay the attacks. State media described them as insignificant, minor, or quickly neutralized. But people are not blind. When the lights go out, when prices rise, when fuel disappears, they know the truth. The silence of official reports cannot drown out the reality of empty pumps and shattered buildings. Ukraine, on the other hand, celebrated the strikes as a turning point. Officials did not hide their pride in the Flamingo missile's debut. Each successful attack sends a message not just to Moscow, but also to Ukraine's allies. We can do this. We can build, we can innovate, and we can strike back. That message is powerful because it proves that Ukraine is not merely dependent on foreign aid. It is capable of producing its own tools of resistance, its own weapons of deterrence. For soldiers on the front lines, these strikes bring hope. Every refinery that burns in Russia, every base destroyed in Crimea, shortens the distance to victory in their minds. For civilians suffering under occupation, it is a reminder that they have not been forgotten, that one day, liberation may truly arrive. But for Russia, the strikes represent a nightmare scenario, a war that is no longer distant, no longer abstract, but painfully real, a war that follows them into their homes, their cars, their daily lives, a war they can no longer ignore. The consequences of these strikes ripple far beyond the craters left in the ground. War is not only about explosions, it is about perception, morale, and momentum. Each successful attack in Crimea and Russia reverberates through the military chain of command, the political structures in Moscow, and the fragile psychology of civilians living under the shadow of war. Military consequences for the Russian military. The strikes are both a tactical setback and a strategic humiliation. Bases that were once considered secure are no longer safe. The Federal Security Service's border post in Armyansk was not a minor outpost. It was a nerve center of control, surveillance, and intimidation in northern Crimea. Its destruction sends a message to every Russian soldier stationed on the peninsula: you are not safe, even here. The same is true for the naval patrol base that was hit. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has already suffered multiple humiliations: the sinking of the Moskva cruiser, the destruction of ships in Sevastopol, and repeated drone boat attacks. Now, even smaller patrol facilities are vulnerable. Each strike chips away at Russia's ability to dominate the Black Sea, forcing Moscow to retreat, reposition, and live in constant fear of the next hit. But perhaps the greatest military consequence lies in logistics. The Krasnodar refinery attack directly undermines Russia's fuel supply. Without fuel, tanks cannot advance, helicopters cannot fly, and supply convoys cannot move. Already, reports from Luhansk and other occupied areas describe shortages so severe that even basic civilian transport is disrupted. If this crisis deepens, Russia will face a nightmare scenario, front lines that cannot be sustained because the lifeline of fuel has been cut. For Ukraine, the psychological boost is enormous. Soldiers at the front now fight with renewed confidence, knowing that their enemy bleeds not only on the battlefield but also behind the lines. Strategically, the ability to strike deep into Crimea and southern Russia opens a new chapter in the war, one where Moscow must stretch its defenses thinner, divert resources to protect its infrastructure, and accept that no part of its war machine is untouchable. Political consequences on the political stage. These strikes are equally devastating. For the Kremlin, for years, Putin has built his authority on the illusion of control. Crimea was his ultimate trophy, paraded as proof of his strength and destiny. Crimea is ours became a slogan, a symbol, a cornerstone of his legitimacy. But when missiles and drones tear through that symbol, when fuel runs dry and panic spreads, the illusion begins to crack. The Russian public is not blind. They may not see everything on state-controlled television, but they see empty fuel stations. They feel the rising prices, they hear the explosions on social media, even if state news calls them minor incidents. Trust in Moscow's ability to shield its people weakens, and with it, the aura of invincibility surrounding Putin. Internationally, these events also shift the narrative. For Ukraine's allies, the successful deployment of the Flamingo missile demonstrates progress, resilience, and technological capability. Western nations, often hesitant about providing more weapons, now see that Ukraine is not a passive recipient of aid, but an active innovator. This strengthens Kyiv's hand in negotiations for further support. For Russia's partners, however, the strikes expose vulnerability. Nations that continue to trade with Moscow or quietly support its economy are reminded that their ally is not as powerful as it claims. This weakens Russia's diplomatic leverage, making isolation more likely in the long term. Civilian consequences yet perhaps. The most visible consequences are felt by ordinary people, both in occupied Ukraine and in Russia itself. In Crimea, the population lives under a new atmosphere of fear. The propaganda that once promised safety now feels hollow. Families worry about where the next missile might land. Parents keep their children indoors. Shops run low on fuel and supplies. Rumors spread like wildfire, amplifying the sense of panic. Some residents quietly pack belongings, preparing for the possibility that they may need to flee. In occupied Luhansk and Donetsk, fuel shortages cut deep into daily life. Farmers cannot operate machinery. Public transport becomes unreliable. Ambulances struggle to refuel. For civilians already trapped in hardship, every missing liter of gasoline feels like another turn of the screw. Inside Russia, the pain is also growing. Long lines at gas stations, arguments at the pump, price hikes in food delivery, transportation delays, all of these small disruptions build into a larger sense of crisis. Ordinary Russians, who once ignored the war or believed it was distant, are now dragged into its reality. They may not see the front lines, but they feel the war every time their tank is empty or their paycheck buys less. This creeping discontent is dangerous for the Kremlin. While repression and propaganda can silence voices, they cannot fill empty fuel tanks. They cannot erase the memory of explosions. They cannot stop the questions whispered in kitchens late at night. If Putin is winning, why are we suffering? If Crimea is safe, why are we afraid? Transition to analysis. Thus, the strikes in Crimea and Krasnodar are not isolated events. They are dominoes falling, one after another, reshaping the war on every level. Militarily, they weaken Russia's logistics. Politically, they shatter illusions of control. Socially, they spread fear, discontent, and doubt. But what do these events mean for the future? How do analysts and experts interpret the rise of Ukraine's new missile power? And what scenarios might unfold in the weeks and months ahead? To answer these questions, we turn now to the deeper analysis of this unfolding catastrophe. When analysts look at the latest strikes, they see more than explosions. They see the beginning of a shift in the dynamics of the war. Wars are often decided not just by sheer numbers, but by momentum, technology, and the ability to adapt. Ukraine's deployment of the Flamingo missile signals that adaptation is happening and that Russia, despite its size, is struggling to respond. Expert views. Military commentators and analysts have been quick to highlight the significance of the Flamingo missile. For months, Ukraine's Western allies debated whether to provide long-range missiles like a TACMS or Storm Shadow. While some were delivered, supplies were limited, and Ukraine's dependence on Western production created uncertainty. The development of a homegrown missile changes everything. Michael Naki, in his latest report, emphasized that this strike is not just a one-time success but a proof of concept. If Ukraine can scale production, Russia's deep rear will no longer be safe. Every base in Crimea, every oil refinery in southern Russia, every military hub within range could become a target. Western defense experts echo this view. They note that Russia's sprawling geography has always been both a strength and a weakness. On the one hand, vast distances provide depth. On the other, they stretch supply lines and make critical infrastructure hard to defend everywhere at once. Ukraine's ability to hit deeper into this geography forces Moscow to spread its defenses thinner, exposing even more vulnerabilities. Russian analysts, in contrast, are alarmed. Some admit that the strikes reveal systemic failures in air defense. Billions of rubles have been invested in the S-300 and S-400 systems, touted as the most advanced in the world. Yet time and again, Ukrainian missiles and drones slip through. The question is no longer whether Russia can defend every site, but whether it can defend any of them reliably. Scenarios for Russia. The road ahead for Russia is dangerous. 3 scenarios now loom on the horizon. Escalation of defense spending and repression. The Kremlin may double down, pouring more resources into air defenses, military industry, and propaganda. This will likely come at the expense of civilians, as funds are diverted from healthcare, education, and infrastructure into the war machine. At the same time, repression will intensify. More arrests, stricter censorship, harsher punishments for dissent. But history shows that repression cannot refill empty fuel tanks. At best, it buys time. Strategic retrenchment. Russia may be forced to pull back its most vulnerable assets from Crimea and southern regions, concentrating them deeper inside the country. While this might protect some bases, it would weaken Russia's ability to project power into Ukraine and the Black Sea. A retreat, even partial, would be seen as a humiliation, proof that Moscow cannot hold the lands it claimed were forever. Russian internal crisis. If fuel shortages deepen and strikes continue, discontent may grow into unrest. While Putin's regime has survived crises before, the combination of battlefield setbacks, economic strain, and domestic frustration could trigger fractures within the elite or unrest among the population. While not inevitable, this scenario is no longer unthinkable. Scenarios for Ukraine. The opportunities are as great as the challenges. Sustained strikes and psychological pressure. With the Flamingo missile, Ukraine can continue to strike high-value targets. Each attack weakens Russia's logistics and morale. Each fire in a refinery, each destroyed base, forces Moscow to spend energy on defense rather than offense. This psychological warfare is as powerful as the physical damage. Leverage in diplomacy. Successful strikes also strengthen Kyiv's position in talks with allies. Demonstrating homegrown innovation proves Ukraine is not simply reliant on foreign weapons. This may encourage more Western support, more funding, and more technology transfers. The message is simple: help us, and we will deliver results. Risks of escalation. Yet Ukraine also faces risks. Russia may respond with increased missile barrages on Ukrainian cities, seeking revenge and trying to break civilian morale. Moscow might also target Ukraine's own energy infrastructure more aggressively, plunging cities into blackouts. Thus, each Ukrainian success carries the danger of harsher retaliation. The future outlook. Looking ahead, one thing is certain: the war has entered a new phase. The introduction of the Flamingo missile means that no place in occupied Crimea, and increasingly no place in southern Russia, is safe. The fear, once confined to Ukrainian cities, is now mirrored in Russian ones. Experts predict that if Ukraine can produce these missiles in significant numbers, Russia will face a logistical nightmare. Constant strikes on oil depots, supply hubs, and command centers could cripple its ability to sustain large-scale offensives. Instead of advancing, Russia may find itself merely trying to survive. Politically, the longer this continues, the more fragile Putin's narrative becomes. The promise of stability erodes under the weight of explosions, shortages, and panic. The cracks in the regime's armor grow wider with each strike, and for civilians, whether in Ukraine or Russia, war becomes ever more real. For Ukrainians, there is hope in every successful strike, a belief that liberation is closer. For Russians, there is fear, doubt, and the slow realization that this war cannot be hidden, cannot be denied, cannot be ignored. Transition to conclusion. Strikes in Crimea and Krasnodar are not the end of the war, but they may mark the beginning of its turning point. History often remembers the battles not by their size, but by their symbolism. And these strikes symbolize something powerful: the collapse of Russia's aura of invulnerability, and the rise of Ukraine's determination to fight with its own strength. The catastrophe has begun for Russia. But for Ukraine, it may be the dawn of a new chapter. The events unfolding in Crimea and southern Russia are not isolated strikes. They are threads woven into a much larger tapestry of modern warfare, strategy, and psychology. To understand their significance, we must go beyond the explosions themselves and consider the broader context. The ripple effects that extend far beyond the battlefields of Armyansk or the smoking chimneys of the Krasnodar refinery. 1. Strategic calculus. From Ukraine's perspective, the use of the new Flamingo missiles is more than a military operation. It is a message to Russia and to the world. Ukraine is not only defending itself but is innovating, adapting, and growing more capable. The introduction of new, domestically produced weapon systems shows a shift away from total reliance on Western arms. It represents sovereignty, not just on the battlefield, but in industry, science, and national will. By striking in Crimea, a territory symbolically and strategically vital to Russia, Ukraine is not only hitting military infrastructure, but also attacking the illusion of security that Moscow has worked so hard to project. Crimea was supposed to be untouchable, a fortress annexed in 2014 and integrated into Russia's narrative of expansion and dominance. Each missile that lands there is a blow, not just to a target, but to the story Russia tells itself and its people. 2. The fragile Russian supply chain wars are rarely won by armies alone. They are won by logistics, by the steady flow of fuel, ammunition, and supplies that keep soldiers moving and machines running. The strikes on refineries and the reports of fuel shortages in places like Luhansk underscore a growing vulnerability in Russia's war effort. Without sufficient fuel, tanks sit idle. Jets cannot launch. Supply trucks grind to a halt. This is not simply an inconvenience, it is a potential chokehold. If Ukraine continues to degrade Russia's fuel infrastructure while maintaining its own supply lines, bolstered by Western support and growing domestic production, the imbalance could shift dramatically. Wars have been lost before, not on the battlefield, but in the warehouses and supply depots that ran dry. 3. Domestic pressure inside Russia. The cracks are not only logistical but also social. Rising fuel prices and shortages hit ordinary Russians directly, especially in rural regions where mobility is tied to survival. When a family cannot afford to fill their car, when farmers struggle to run tractors, when lines appear at gas stations, these everyday hardships become powerful political forces. For a government that relies heavily on projecting strength and stability, such visible signs of weakness can be corrosive. They plant seeds of doubt in the population. If Russia is winning, why are we suffering? If we are strong, why do we lack fuel? These questions can be more dangerous to the Kremlin than any missile, because they eat away at legitimacy from within. 4. Global geopolitical reverberations. The war in Ukraine is not confined to Ukraine. Every missile that falls in Crimea sends ripples through the global order. NATO and the West see in these strikes a validation of their support. Their investments in Ukrainian defense training, intelligence, weapons are paying dividends. Neutral countries are reminded that Russia is not untouchable. This perception matters for nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that have long balanced carefully between Moscow and the West. Energy markets react sharply to refinery strikes and fuel shortages, as investors and governments fear disruptions in oil exports or supply instability. Each event in Crimea and Krasnodar is, therefore, not just a local battle but part of a global chessboard where every move is watched, analyzed, and recalculated. 5. Russia's dilemma for Moscow. The dilemma is acute retaliation is expected, but against whom? If Russia escalates attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, it risks further alienating neutral states and hardening Western resolve. If it restrains itself, it looks weak. If it commits more resources to Crimea, it risks exposing vulnerabilities elsewhere. Every choice carries risks, and the field of maneuver is narrowing. 6. The psychological front. Perhaps the most important battlefield is the one we cannot see, the human mind. Warfare today is as much about perception as destruction. In Crimea, every explosion resonates not only in military reports but in the hearts of those living under occupation. Fear grows, doubt spreads, rumors multiply. The idea that Crimea is safe is shattered, and once an illusion breaks, it cannot easily be restored. For Russians, the knowledge that Ukrainian missiles can reach deep into what Moscow considers its own territory is destabilizing. It undermines faith in the state's ability to protect, and it raises unspoken but powerful questions about the future. Transition to conclusion. We now stand at a crossroads. The strikes in Crimea and Krasnodar may be the opening chords of a larger symphony, one of escalation, uncertainty, and shifting power balances. What happens next will depend not only on weapons and strategies, but on resilience, adaptation, and the ability of nations to endure hardship in pursuit of their goals. As the smoke rises over Crimea and the fires burn in Krasnodar, one thing becomes painfully clear: the war is no longer distant. It has reached into places once thought untouchable, exposing vulnerabilities that were carefully concealed behind walls of propaganda and fortifications. For the people of Crimea, for the civilians in occupied Luhansk, for the citizens across Russia, the war has become immediate, tangible, and unavoidable. The introduction of Ukraine's Flamingo missile marks a turning point. It is not merely a new weapon, it is a symbol of determination, innovation, and resilience. It represents a nation refusing to be passive, a nation that refuses to accept occupation and aggression as permanent. Each successful strike sends a signal: Ukraine is capable. Ukraine is evolving. And Ukraine will fight not only with the support of allies, but with its own ingenuity. For Russia, the consequences are profound. Military, economic, and social pressures. are mounting simultaneously. Bases once considered secure are now vulnerable. Key infrastructure is at risk. Fuel shortages disrupt everyday life, strain logistics, and weaken morale. Citizens feel the war at the pumps, in the stores, and in the lines that stretch through towns and cities. These are not abstract threats, they are tangible reminders of the limits of state power and the fragility of control. Politically, the Kremlin faces a growing dilemma. The narrative of stability and invincibility is under siege. Propaganda can attempt to mask reality, but empty fuel stations, rising prices, and explosions in occupied territories tell their own story. Each failure to defend critical infrastructure chips away at the image of absolute control. Internal dissent, quietly simmering, becomes harder to ignore. Strategically, the war may now enter a new phase. Russia must choose between reinforcing its defenses in Crimea and the south, risking vulnerabilities elsewhere, or accepting the possibility that some losses are inevitable. Ukraine, meanwhile, gains a stronger bargaining position both militarily and diplomatically. The ability to strike deep into previously secure Russian territory strengthens Ukraine's credibility, boosts morale on the front lines, and signals to the world that it can sustain and innovate its own defense. Yet this turning point is also a reminder of the human cost. Every missile, every explosion, every disruption in daily life carries consequences for ordinary people. Families live in fear, communities face shortages, civilians endure hardships far removed from the front lines, but deeply shaped by them. In war, the line between battlefield and home blurs. Civilians become unwilling participants, and their endurance becomes part of the larger story of conflict. Looking ahead, the path is uncertain. The war may intensify as Russia attempts retaliation, or it may see further technological escalation as Ukraine continues to deploy advanced weaponry. Global attention will remain fixed, and the decisions made in Moscow and Kyiv will reverberate far beyond the immediate region. Energy markets, diplomatic relations, and military alliances will all feel the impact of every strike, every strategic adjustment, and every failure to secure territory. In the end, the events of Crimea and Krasnodar are more than a military confrontation. They are a story of resilience versus complacency, innovation versus stagnation, and courage versus fear. They remind us that no fortress is truly impenetrable. Narrative of invincibility can survive forever, and that even in the darkest hours, the human will to resist and endure can alter the course of history. The war will continue, but the rules are changing. Ukraine has demonstrated that it can strike with precision, think strategically, and challenge an opponent far larger and better funded. Russia must adapt, or risk further setbacks, deeper crises, and growing instability. Civilians, both in Ukraine and Russia, will continue to bear the weight of these decisions, enduring uncertainty and fear while hoping for resolution. As viewers, observers, and participants in this story of global significance, we are reminded that history is being written not only by generals and politicians, but also by engineers, innovators, and ordinary people whose courage and resilience shape outcomes. The missiles that struck Crimea are symbols of that determination, a testament to the enduring human spirit, and a warning that even the mightiest powers are vulnerable when confronted by ingenuity, resolve, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. This is the moment where the war's future is still being decided, where the balance of power is shifting, and where the courage of a nation stands against the illusion of invincibility. The fires in Crimea, the smoke over Krasnodar, and the lines at gas stations in Luhansk are not just events, they are the prelude to a new chapter, one in which the stakes have never been higher and the outcome remains uncertain.